Other questions?
Professor, do you have a pen I can borrow?
I do. Okay. Other questions?
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Is there a way to check the reading check on the morning?
It should be. Yeah, you should be able to pull it up and see all of the questions and the answers. Or at least the answers that you got right. I think it will not tell you the right answer if you got one wrong. I mean, if you retake it enough times and you get it all right, then it'll tell you. But yeah, if you have any problems pulling up or seeing it or anything like that, again, I'm happy to help. Okay, other questions, comments? No, all right, so today we're gonna have our first discussion of primary sources. So we had 2 primary source documents assigned for today, numbers 1 and 2, from the historians Herodotus and Thucydides. So again, for the primary sources, right, you want to have them here in class, that you can access them. So whether you access them on an electronic device, whether you have paper copies, like your old school like me, right, whatever's best for you, but you want to have the primary sources to look at. So we'll be talking about these in a little bit. But if you want to pull them up now, that would be good. All right. So Kieran is here, right? And Gabriella. Gabriella? And Abdul, right? Great. And Mark, there, okay, perfect. Okay, Mohammed, is normally up there. Nicolette, is there. Tamo, is there. Cosmo. Taisha, there. Okay, Jordan. Brian. Johan, there, perfect. Sai. Chris is there, Chris. Okay, Anthony is there. Brian is back. Lauren, and Jeremy. Perfect. Okay, perfect. All right. All right, so our last class, we talked about ancient Middle East, or ancient Near East, or Southwest Asia, right? Remember, 3 names for the same region of the world, right? And why it was so important in the 2nd millennium BCE, right? And where we ended up. I have this here again, right? Significance of Southwest Asia. It was the center of the universe, for lack of better words. The richest, most powerful, most technologically developed, most kind of cosmopolitan, culturally sophisticated region of the world at the time, right? So, the center of everything, right? Greece and Rome out here are on the margins of that world, right? They are out in the middle of nowhere, kind of barely connected to that world. But the connection's going to grow. That's a little bit what we're going to talk about today. All right. Everyone good on that in the 2nd millennium? Generally speaking, yeah? So this is all what we talked about last time. Okay. Oh, wait, one other thing to go back here. Reminder again, focus questions, right? So on the front of each slide for the day, we've got the questions, which kind of our class is oriented around, right? How did the Minoan and Mycenaean cultures evolve? How were the Minoan and the Mycenaean cultures connected to Southwest Asia, right? So by the end of class today, you want to be able to answer these 2 questions. All right, early Greece. How do we know what we know? Big answer, number 1 answer, archaeology. Digging up material culture, objects from the past. For example, statue of a harp player, 2800 BCE. So, what are the kind of benefits and drawbacks to using material culture as a historical source? Like the harp player. Brian, what do you have?
A lot of goods can be traded and thus from different civilizations that are in the
Okay. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's good in the sense that it shows us that they can be treated, but it's bad in the sense that we can't decipher if it belongs to the original culture.
Okay, right? So maybe it's a tricky source to use, right? With material culture of trying to figure out exactly what its connection is to its find spot. Is it something that was made there, or something that was brought there, or what does that mean? Okay, what else? Anthony?
If the material, like based on the material that they use, is it like is it abundant towards that specific region?
Okay. And so why is that useful or not useful?
You can tell, like, locate where it's actually from. So if it's from like somewhere in the Middle East, that specific like ore, like whatever it was made
I
of.
see. Okay, so you're connecting it with Breider's point in the sense of how do you determine where something comes from, right? So there's things that you can do like looking at the materials and where are the materials found naturally. Okay, true. But again, what's the benefit for historians having something like this? Nicolette?
We can see that they had musical instruments.
Okay,
It adds to things as a bonus.
okay. So again, it tells us something about their technology, maybe entertainment and arts. Okay, Gabrielle?
Just evidence that a civilization existed.
Okay. So how does this tell us that it existed?
Maybe depends on the archaeologists, like their interpretations and stuff.
Okay, absolutely. But like, is this going to tell you something different than something else that you find? I mean, it could, right? It depends on what this is. So it's not just finding an object, but it's what the object represents, right? So the material that it's made out of, right? The way that it's made, those can be helpful, but also what the image is can tell us something, right? What else? All right, maybe ask this, what can't material culture tell us?
When it comes to material culture, it may be hard to figure out who made it.
Okay. We might not know who made it, right? Not just like what culture made it, but the artists themselves, right? With writing, you might get their name on it. But if you don't have writing, right, you don't know. What else is something where, I guess, material culture maybe can't tell us everything? Good.
You can't tell us about like their society. Like you can tell us their social classes, what they dealt with. Besides the fact that someone played the harp at some point that they thought to recreate it, but to really tell us how their society functioned.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a counterexample. Say you discover two tombs, and they roughly date from the same time period. You find one tomb where there's a skeleton and maybe some broken pieces of pottery. Unpainted, cheap pottery. You find another tomb, again, same time period. It's 10 times as big, filled with gold, ornamental weapons, all sorts of luxuries. Can you learn something maybe about the society from those two graves?
Yeah.
About inequality maybe, or wealth distribution, or what could you learn?
Well, we see that from one tomb that there is somebody with great wealth and power.
Mhm.
And from the second tomb, you could theorize either that the person didn't have money or their tomb was raided.
Right, okay, or something like that, right? So, I mean, there are things that we can kind of pick depending on what the objects are, right? We can make some broad things. But to your point, right, how did these two people get along? Was there animosity about this person having, that stuff might not be evident, right? So, it might be able to tell us some things about the society, but we run into a wall if we keep asking questions. Mark?
Like, how do you treat the time period of like sculpture?
Oh, how can you tell the time period on this?
Yeah, like how you treat it as from that period of time? Because like, you can find something anytime, anywhere, like just be like years,
Mhm.
and like how do you treat like confirm that the sculpture was from that period of time?
So there's all different techniques that archaeologists use to kind of date. So it's everything from the materials that are used to the artistic techniques that are used, and then where they were basically dug up, like how deep in the ground they were, and then adding a new level of corrective to this is, as scientific techniques of dating organic matter, like radiocarbon dating has gotten better, it's easier to kind of compare what date other materials are and compare, then be able to get a more kind of certain date on the object itself. So it's not perfect, but we have ways of being pretty confident that it came from a certain time period. That being said, every couple of years, we still come up with something that we think is really old that turns out to have been forged, like in the 1950s or something like that. So it's not a perfect system. Right. What else? What else is the limitation? Right? Material culture is great, but sometimes you hit a wall in terms of what you can tell. It becomes a little bit harder to maybe communicate complex ideas, cause and effect. Not impossible, right? So going back to the great question about, well, what was the relationship between rich and poor in this society? Did their differences in wealth affect their differences in political rights, for example, right? How did that person get all of their wealth? Was it something stolen? Was it something given to the person? Did they make it by being a really, so more kind of complex explanations or connections or feelings are harder to get from material culture. Not impossible, but this is something where written sources, right, where people actually write down their thoughts or their ideas, might give us a little bit more insight, right? The reason I'm bringing this up is for early Greece, pretty much all we have is material culture. So the cultures I'm talking about today, right, for the most part, right, we are relying on objects, archaeology that we've dug up. There are written texts, right? Written texts from Greece really start to proliferate about 800 BCE, right? So a little bit later down the timeline. And sometimes they can tell us something about the past, like the ones we're looking at today. But still, that kind of distance, right? The chronological distance makes them kind of spotty, right? So this is why we know less about Minoan and Mycenaean cultures than, say, we know about later Greece, right? Like later Athens. So the story of early Greece, right, starts about 6500 BCE. This is where we start to see permanent villages in the area that is Greece. Right? So most humans are, at this point in history, still hunter-gatherers. Agriculture is going to be developed here around the year 9000, so about 2,500 years before that. It'll start kind of spreading this way, right? Increasingly, people to the west will start adopting agriculture, right? So 6,500 people, whether they were living in Greece already and learned about these techniques, or whether they migrated in and brought it with them, we don't know, right? But they start to set up permanent villages utilizing agriculture, right? So the first kind of what we might think of as being urban, right? Or at least pseudo-urban, meaning kind of something bigger than a village, actually occurs in Crete, right? So we've got Greece proper up here. We've got Crete, the big island here to the south. And around the year 2000, we see the rise of what modern historians call Minoan culture. So the first, again, urban might be a little bit of a stretch, but at least pseudo-urban, right? Larger scale culture in this region of Greece. Okay? All right. Now, we don't know what this culture, what they called themselves, right? Partly, I don't have it up here, but because we haven't also deciphered their language yet, right? So we call them, modern historians call them the Minoan culture. We've named them after King Minos. So King Minos was a famous figure from ancient Greek mythology. Anyone heard of King Minos before? Abdul, have you heard of King Minos? Yeah, who's King Minos? What did you?
He used to bring the people to the labyrinth.
Right. And what was in the labyrinth?
The
The Minotaur, right? Named after King Minos. The half bull, half human, right? He kept it in the maze underneath his palace. And that he would basically take people as tribute from Greek cities and bring them and feed them to his Minotaur, right? So that was a popular story in later Greek myth. And where did King Minos live? Crete, right? In these later myths. So, kind of in reference to that, historians refer to this as Minoan culture. So around the year 2000 BCE, like I said, we see cities or kind of pseudo-cities, and they're organized around grand structures that we call palaces, right? We actually don't know what they're used for exactly, right? I'll show you some pictures in a second, but just historians just started calling them palaces, right? We know very little about the cities themselves. Was Crete a unified country, like a unified kingdom, like we saw in Southwest Asia? Probably not. Probably these are city-states, where each city or kind of palace area was independent, but we don't know. We can tell, right, that they were religious and economic centers. They were centers of trade, right? And they were centers of worship. And that people from the kind of surrounding area would travel to these cities, most likely to engage in trading or worship, right? And we also know that there was a small wealthy elite. How do we know this? Well, largely because of burials, right? We've been able to pull up tombs, and it's clear that there was some people there that had lots of money. 1650, right? There's massive earthquakes are going to strike the region, massive destruction. Most of the palaces are going to be leveled. The earthquakes are that big. Here's a close-up map of Greece, right? Here you can see basically the palace sites are these little squares. You don't really need to know this now, right? But you see them kind of scattered around the island, right? It also marks kind of other big houses and other tombs. So we see settlements kind of all around the island of Crete. So the Minoans had, obviously, not just a verbal language, but a written language. We have not been able to decipher it. We don't know what language the Minoans spoke, and from what survives of the writing system, we haven't been able to connect it with anything else. Working backwards, and I'll tell you why in a second, their language does not appear to be related to ancient Greek, right? So at this point, do they count as early Greeks? Well, they're in the region that we call Greece. They're going to be connected culturally to Greece, but a different language. A little complicated, right? So they developed their own writing system, about 1800, that modern historians call Linear A. Here is an example of Linear A. You've got symbols up here, right, that represent syllables in the language. So it's not a one-to-one like letter symbol, right, like we have like the modern English alphabet. It's that these represent, most likely, syllables tied to larger words. But as I said, we've not been able to decipher their writing yet. And there's not a whole lot of it that survives. We can also tell that there was shared religious practices. That there were certain sites located in caves that appeared to be visited by people from other areas of the island. And we gather this based on the artifacts that have been discovered and the similarities between what we find in some caves and what we find on other sites. So it appears that there was kind of a common culture that linked these peoples together, but again, probably the cities themselves were politically independent. So it's a lot of we don't know. So like I said, massive earthquakes hit about 1650, leveled most of the palaces. There's going to be a very quick rebuilding effort. So this tells us something, right? If a territory can be devastated by earthquakes and rebuild pretty quickly, it tells us, right, that they probably have some resources on hand. that this is not kind of a poorer country, right? Because they're able to kind of bounce back quickly. So again, it suggests something about kind of the wealth or maybe the kind of power of Minoan leaders. So here is the new palace that was built after the earthquake at the site of Knossos, which was one of the major kind of urban sites on Crete. So we get an aerial photograph of the archaeological site today, about the size of 3 football fields put together. Over 300 rooms. Again, this is what we call a palace, but again, we're not entirely sure like what it's for and what the idea is behind it. It was built out of stone and brick, supported with wooden beams, going to be 2 and 3 stories high. Right? In areas, there are also going to be extensive storage basements underneath the palace, and that'll become important in a second. All right, some more pictures from Knossos. Here is an artist's recreation of what they think the palace might have looked like. Again, a lot of guesswork here, right? But this kind of grand, big courtyard, arena here, we've got the buildings with the columns, this kind of massive big structure, right? So a guesswork of what it might have looked like. So here are some remnants of the palace, right? Once again, the colors themselves did not survive. It was only by kind of studying like fragments of paint that were left and using other types of kind of imaging techniques that people have tried to kind of repaint and reconstruct the colors, so we get a sense of what it would look like. Brian, do you have a question or just? No? Okay. So here's part of the palace, right? Again, you can see bright colors, columns. One of the storage areas, right? So I mentioned they had extensive basements underneath, right? And it's clear this was used for the storage of goods. We have these big kind of containers, amphora, right, which were used to store grains, foodstuffs, also things like money, right, all packed beneath the palace, right? And we'll talk more about this in Wednesday's class when we talk about the economy. Connected to what gets called, and you'll read about this, a redistributive economy. That's reading for Wednesday. Here we have a monument, part of the palace, called the Horns, right? You can see why people call it the Horns. Because of something else we see. We think that this might be a symbol or a site of religious importance. Right, I'll show you another picture a little bit down the road that kind of leads us to make this connection. But again, very big, very monumental, right? It's like a story high. You see it kind of standing out there in the palace. Minoan, again, what we call a snake goddess. Again, we don't really know for sure, but I talked about those kind of cave sanctuaries where there was evidence of kind of visitors from all over the islands, right? They seem to be, or at least one of them seems to be connected with this figure. We have a couple of statuettes of this kind of serious-looking figure holding snakes in her hands, right? Who is this? What do they represent? I don't know, right? But again, we assume it's some sort of maybe religious figure or goddess, maybe connected to the earth. Minoan pottery. So again, pottery was made and decorated, and we're going to find Minoan pottery shipped all throughout the Eastern Mediterranean region. Minoan art fresco, right? So as you notice from some of the previous pictures, the Minoans really loved bright colors, it appears, and they're not alone in the ancient world like that. And there were lots of fresco paintings, so paintings done on wet plaster throughout the palace, right? Now the art style itself, so here's an example of a Minoan scene, right? And here you're gonna just have to trust me, as I trust other experts, is going to be influenced by artistic techniques from Southwest Asia. So meaning Egyptians, right, people in Mesopotamia, their art has made its way to Crete, even though we haven't found remnants of it, or at least people from Crete were familiar with it. And they adapted elements of Near Eastern art into their own unique style. So one thing I mentioned, right, we talked about the horns, and we think that it might be a site of religious significance, right? Images of bulls are all over the place, right, in the Minoan palaces. Now, we heard something about bowls before, right? We mentioned something about a bowl before, I think, right? Abdul mentioned something. The Minotaur, right? This much later Greek myth, right? That's being told centuries later about the evil King Minos on Crete, who has this half bull, half man monster, right? So there's this connection that later Greeks have between bulls and Crete. Doesn't seem to come out of nowhere, right? Because again, the Minoans themselves, all over the place, had bulls painted. Minotaurs, no evidence of Minotaurs, right? But bulls themselves, everywhere, right? And we think that there was some sort of religious significance connected with the bull, or that the bull was tied in with maybe religious ceremonies, right? Hence, the horns, supposed to kind of maybe represent bull horns. So a scene that we see a lot, that we assume is a combination of religion and entertainment, is bull jumping. So, here we have kind of a scene in motion, right? Where what seems to happen is that there would be a bull, someone would run up, they would grab the horns, flip up, flip over their back, ta-da, flipping over the running bull, right? So again, it's a scene that gets popped up a lot. We're like, why are people doing this? Again, probably some combination of entertainment, maybe religion as well too. Yeah,
What do a lot of these civilizations actually worship bulls? I mean, if you look at the Hebrews, they actually worship Baal, which was a god, a statue of a bull. So
yeah, bulls get connected a lot with divinity. Briar?
Yeah, adding on to what he said, so bulls were a common motif in the ancient world for their vitality and
Right.
charismatic culture. Although I would have to disagree about it being Baal, because Baal is more or less associated with Semitic cultures, and even though we don't know if they were necessarily Greek, it's more or less likely that they could have connected to a European god like Dionysus, who's also
Yeah, well, all right, so there's going to be a lot of connection and influence between the cultures in Southwest Asia, right, and in our case, the Greeks as well too. So there are going to be religious traditions from Egypt, from Mesopotamia, from the Levant that are going to make their way into religious customs as well too. So even though they might have kind of deeper origins farther apart, right? The cultural sharing, the religious sharing is going to be thick and influential, we should say, here. So a lot of influence is going on. So even though something might not belong to a culture originally, we're going to see it trickling in over time. So yes, bulls are really common imagery, common animals for sacrifice. Even still, right, historians are like, the Minoans seem to really like bulls. Like, even compared to all of that, bulls appear a lot in Minoan art. So again, maybe they just like painting bulls. We don't know. All right. What was that? Something?
Maybe it was their source of food, their livestock.
I mean, possibly. Possibly. I mean, we don't know. All of the above, right? That was one of the benefits. We'll talk about ancient religion later too, but one of the benefits to animal sacrifice is that you get to eat the leftovers, right? So ancient cultures would sacrifice animals to the gods would get their share, and then the rest would be available for consumption. Okay. Already kind of mentioned this, but just to kind of hammer this in again, right, is that we see Minoan culture very closely kind of connected with Southwest Asia, right? From Southwest Asia's perspective, yeah, it's kind of out there, sure, whatever, with one exception, right? But we see Southwest Asian influences definitely coming into Crete. Heading out, I mentioned Minoan pottery is going to be found throughout Southwest Asia. There was definitely a market for that. Minoan art is going to spread throughout the Aegean region in the Mediterranean. And we're even going to see decorations in an Egyptian palace. So here is the island of Thera. You can see just to the north of Crete with the red arrow. Here is a later wall painting from Thera, done again in this Minoan style. right? So we see kind of the cultural influence spreading northwards. Here's another one, right? Notice again, similar text, colors, style. This one's really interesting. So over here in Egypt, oh, my arrow disappeared. Right about down, let's see, right about down here, right, was Avaris, right, which was one of the Egyptian capitals. There was a story told about one of the pharaohs who married kind of a Western princess. We weren't quite sure what to make of that until archaeologists discovered this in one room of the Egyptian palace, right? And what does that look like? Well, again, it's kind of only a fragment, but it looks a lot like this, doesn't it? Right? So it looks like the same Minoan style of art, right? Even the same scene of bull jumping that was painted in a wall, in a room, in an Egyptian palace. So maybe, you know, what this means when they talk about one of the pharaohs marrying a Western, you know, kind of princess is maybe he married a Cretan, right? A Minoan noblewoman. Again, we don't know, but we're seeing connections, right? That the Minoan culture is both drawing upon, right, kind of the cultural influence that's coming this way from this important cultural center, but then it's also kind of making its own impact. All right, so let's turn to our primary sources now. We have Herodotus and Thucydides. When did these historians write? When did they write? Nicola?
400 BC, around
400 BC. Yeah, about then, right? What's the distance between what they're writing and what we were just talking about with Minoan culture?
Pretty large.
Pretty big, right?
Yeah.
About how many years are we talking about?
Like 1,500 years.
Yeah,
like
between
that.
1,500 or 1,000 years later, right? So these guys are writing way in the future, right? We're calling them primary sources for this class, right? Kind of quotes, but know now, right? I mean, they're 1,000 years after these cultures. All right, so the first thing I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about their approach to history themselves, right? How did the Greeks themselves study the past? All right, so what I'd like you to do is take a couple minutes and review the first paragraph from each of these documents. So number 1 and number 2. So very quickly kind of review, look over. Okay, so in the first paragraph of each author, they both set out their goal, right? What they want to accomplish for their history. So what are the goals of Herodotus and Thucydides? Kevin?
Having an accurate order of events according to their investigation.
I mean, regarding what? What is their, if you were answering the question, what is the main goal of their history? What do they want to do? Nicola.
What their intentions are is to really see the difference between realistic history concerning the ancient Greeks through Homer's eyes. They kind of want to depict the realization of that instead of the romanticized version that Homer gives.
So you're not wrong. in the sense that they are doing that. But it's not really what their goal is. Why are they writing their history? Both authors want to accomplish something. In the first paragraph, they say, this is why I'm writing my history. I will give you a hint, it has nothing to do with the Minoans. Abdul, what do you have?
They hope to reveal short historical account
Of?
of their history.
Yeah, but what of?
Troy,
No?
the Trojan War.
No. You might guess the Trojan War, I guess. Maybe that one's not fair. Maybe that one's close, right? The beginning of Herodotus. This is the display of the inquiry of Herodotus of Halicarnassus, so that things done by man not be forgotten in time, and that great and marvelous deeds, some displayed by the Hellenes, some by the barbarians, not lose their glory, including, among others, what was the cause of their waging war on each other. So what's his goal? He wants to make sure, he says, the great deeds are remembered. Okay, that's nice, pretty broad. Does he get a little bit more specific on what great deeds he wants remembered?
Kidnappings.
Just this first paragraph, so don't think about the other stuff, just the first paragraph. What's he want? Sure.
What was the cause of the war?
What's that?
What was the cause of the war?
What was the cause of the war, right? And the war between
Greeks.
the Greeks and the barbarians, right? But again, he wants that the great deeds be remembered, some done by the Greeks, some done by the barbarians. It's a loaded word that we'll talk about later. And the cause of their waging war on one another. So the goal is, again, what's his purpose? What's his history going to be about? Yes, it's about great deeds and important things, but what do you think he's going to focus on?
Getting both sides of the story.
About? What's the story about?
Why they could wage war on each other.
Right, why they waged war on one another, right? So the both sides thing is actually going to be really important to him, right? But he wants to get an account about why they waged this war on each other. Now, I can see why you might think the Trojan War, but this is where we have to go back to the background information, right? Herodotus was an Athenian, this is the first, at the very top of the background, was an Athenian geographer and historian who wrote an account of the 5th century war between the Greeks and the Persians. In order to gather background information for his work, Herodotus is in different locations, yada, yada, yada. So what is the war between the Greeks and the Greeks and the barbarians that he wants to write about? The Persian War. The war that takes place. You might not be familiar with this yet, right? So you might have encountered it in movies or something like that, or popular literature, right? We'll definitely talk about it later. But again, it's the war in the 5th century. And he says, this is what my goal of history is. I want to talk about the great deeds done by Greeks and non-Greeks, basically kind of culminating with this big war that they fight, right? Which again, is going to be a big kind of changing war, okay? So that's his goal. I'll come back to him in a second. What about Thucydides then? So again, just the first paragraph. What's his goal? This is maybe a little bit more straightforward. What's his goal? Nicolette?
To find out what happened for the Peloponnesian War.
Right. Another great war that's going to happen about, we'll say, 50 years later, right? That Thucydides says is the greatest war ever. Ha, my war is greater than your war, Herodotus. So he wants to write about the great deeds that were done leading up to this war between the Peloponnesians and the Spartans. So they're both want to talk about things that are, kind of part of their world, right? World, kind of events that they were both either part of or connected to, right? So they're not really interested in, or their focus isn't going to be on the older stuff, right? This is kind of what I'm getting. Their focus is going to be on how do I explain and talk about these 2 recent wars that took place. Okay. Now, here's where things get unusual, and this is where maybe it kind of led people astray. Where do they start their story about how these 2 recent wars took place or erupted? Where do they start their story?
Would be from the Trojan.
Like before the Trojan War, way back as far as they go, right? So they're like, I'm going to talk about this kind of recent event, but I want to show, right, way back in the past, there's things that are kind of, leading to it, okay? And both are going to be a little bit different how they approach the past, but they both go far, far back in the past, before the time of writing, way behind, before their own time, right? To try to get more information about this more recent event that they want to talk about, okay? So one, that's kind of the first thing to realize, is that their kind of starting point is way, 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 way back in the past, right? Now again, as we talked about earlier, there's not a lot of great sources for the past. We don't have written sources, right? We've got material culture, that we talked about the Minoans. Even though they left a little bit of writing, we can't read it. Everything that we know that comes from material culture. But there's another source of information, right? Now, whether it's a good source of information or not, that might be debatable. What's the other source of information that Herodotus and Thucydides are going to use to study early history? Now, this is Nicolette.
Homer's Iliad,
Homer's Iliad, or even more broadly,
his poems.
his poems, even broader than Homer. Jeremy, did you have something?
Mythological stories.
Mythological stories, right? The oral stories that people are telling one another. Stories of the Minotaur, stories of Perseus and Andromeda, stories of, kind of Europa the cow, and all these things, right? That these are popular stories that Greek authors are writing about, that people are talking about, right? And they're part, to a certain extent, of their kind of religious experience as well, too, right? And they're stories that are supposed to take place in the past. Okay? Mark.
Were they like written like stories, or like they were verbal stories that you just transferred?
Excellent question. They start off as verbal stories, and they're going to be passed down verbally for hundreds of years,
Wow.
and then eventually they're going to be written down. Now, who's familiar with the game of telephone? Has anyone heard of the game of telephone before? What's the problem with passing things down over generations? Abdul? Things can get changed a bit, right? And then you end up with something that's really different, right? So this is things, we don't know exactly how much things might have changed over time as they get passed down verbally. All right, so Herodotus and Thucydides, they have access to these stories. Now, again, they know that these are stories that the Greeks tell about their past, about things that happened way, way back in the time kind of before calendars, in the back in the day time. And they also know these stories don't really look a lot like their own present day. There's lots of monsters. There's lots of giants, people doing superheroic things, right? That people in their day can't do. Some people say, well, that was just the past. That was a heroic age. It's past. We're on to something new. Both Herodotus and Thucydides, though, take a slightly different approach. They have access to these stories about the past. And they look at them and they're like, well, I don't know if I believe this thing about a Minotaur. But what do they want to do? Right? This is what Nicolette said earlier, right? Is, well, maybe if we kind of look at these stories logically, we investigate them, maybe we can figure out what's true versus what's made up. Maybe there's kernels of truth embedded in these kind of fantastic stories that are alive today. So this is what they do, right? Is that they kind of try to evaluate these myths to see if they can discern the true story that kind of lends itself to their explanation about these contemporary great wars. That was a mouthful. All right. Thoughts about this? So right now we're kind of focusing on historical method, what they want to do, and how they go about doing it. Everyone good with that? So again, they want to write about these contemporary wars that are in their own time. They want to go back really far in time to kind of tell the whole story. The problem is sources. So we look at myths, we look at stories, we try to figure out what we can learn, what truth we can learn from this. Okay, we're going to come back to these, so keep the sources, we're going to come back to them in a second. It's kind of an interlude here. All right. So, we're going to transition now from Minoan culture to Mycenaean culture. So as I mentioned earlier, right, we see evidence of the first villages in Greece about 6,500 BCE. 4,500 years later, appears to be when, again, this is a lot of guesswork, the first Greek speakers arrive, right? So the first people speaking the Greek language that's going to kind of take root here are going to come, right? So again, more latecomers to the region. They're going to settle, they're going to establish their own villages, right? The archaeological record shows us this. 1600 BCE, new rapid growth. These villages are going to explode upwards. Maybe explode is not the right word. They are going to grow very big and very rich and very majestic very, very quickly. So what do we see with these new Mycenaean kind of cities? One, they're kind of characterized by very, very rich, wealthy tombs, right? So that there are rich, wealthy tombs that are associated with these new Mycenaean cities. Again, seeing a connection maybe between the rapid growth. We see that these Mycenaean cities, which I should also point out are on the Greek mainland, especially here in southern Greece, right, have contact with the Minoans. And that Minoan pottery is going to be found in the Mycenaean sites. The best evidence for the contact, though, is the writing system that develops, right? So, here's an example. This is called a Tholos tomb, right? Of the type of tomb that was these grand tombs that were associated with Mycenaean cities, right? Kind of entryway, kind of built in, kind of this big beehive-looking structure where the person would be interred there in the middle. Rich grave goods found in the tomb, right? So this is a gold burial mask. So a mask made of gold leaf that would have been kind of fastened to the face of the body, right? It gets called the Mask of Agamemnon. Agamemnon being a famous king from Homer's Iliad, right? We don't know whose mask this is, but that's what it gets called. So here's what I was going for. Mycenaean Linear B. So, we found this writing system. Looks very similar to the writing system that we found in Crete. And for many years, people thought they were the same writing system because the symbols were the same. Then the more and more they looked at it, they were like, no, it's the same symbols, or very similar symbols, but different languages. So that people are using essentially the same alphabet to write different languages, much like the same alphabets used to write like English and Spanish. And they study it some more, and all of a sudden they figure out, wait a second, this language is Greek. They knew how to speak Greek, right, from later written texts. And they recognize that this is an archaic version of the Greek language, written with the Minoan script. So clearly what has happened, right, what we know now, we see this happening in other areas of the world, is that there's contact between the Minoans on Crete, the Mycenaeans on Greece mainland. They become aware of the Minoan writing system, the script that the Minoans used to write down their language. They adopt the script to write down the Mycenaean language. In other words, Greek. So this is going to be essentially the first script used to write down the Greek language. So we're able to decipher it and read the scraps that survive, which largely seem to be like lists of goods. All right. So again, rapid growth, lots of money, contact with Minoan culture. 100 years later, the Mycenaeans invade Crete, take over the Minoan palaces. So from the archaeological record, we can tell that basically Crete was occupied by Mycenaean forces and under Mycenaean control. Until eventually, for some reason, maybe this was ongoing fighting, we don't know, right? The palace at Knossos is going to be destroyed a little bit after. Okay, those two, rich goods. All right, now the Mycenaean palaces, which start to emerge as part of these new cities, right? So we get rich cities, big tombs, and then shortly after, right about the time they're invading Crete, they start building up their own kind of big palaces in the cities. Now these palaces are very different, though, than the Minoan palaces. So the Minoan palaces appear to be these kind of cultural and economic centers, and maybe kind of the same is true to a lesser extent for the Mycenaean palaces, but it wasn't their main purpose. These were castles. These were fortresses. They were designed for warfare, for defending the land, and for holding out against sieges, right? So the number one kind of purpose behind these was military, even though they might have served other purposes as well, right? So again, similar to the Minoans, in there are these new big central palaces, but very different construction for different primary purposes. Okay, so here's a site of this. This is the site at Mycenae, which was one of the biggest of these Mycenaean cities, and it's where the culture gets its name from, right? So the culture, again, we don't know what they called themselves, but we call it Mycenaean because one of the biggest cities was Mycenae, right? So again, with these giant fortresses, what do we see? Evidence of even more money coming in. So the Mycenaeans are continuing to get more and more wealth, right? The question is, where are they getting this wealth from? Well, hold that thought, right? The other thing we see, significance of warfare. That warfare with the large fortified palaces seems to be on their minds. So where are they getting their wealth from? Well, if we go back here, what's happening right before this? They've conquered Crete, right? Or at least they've invaded Crete. And we know, right, in antiquity, one of the biggest ways of acquiring new resources and new goods is conquest, taking it from someone else. The Minoan culture was a rich, wealthy culture, right? It seems like the Mycenaeans are taking advantage of this. And the Minoans aren't going to be the only ones. All right. Again, just some pictures. Here we have the palace walls from the palace at Mycenae, right? Again, big, thick stone, right? Kind of cut and placed in place, right? And this is not a decorative wall, not a retaining wall, right? This is a defensive wall that's being built. The famous Lion Gate, no real purpose, I guess just showing it, right? This was above the main gate in the Mycenaean palace, right? Here we've got two lions on top of the gate that were carved out of stone. At the center of these Mycenaean palaces, in different ones, right throughout Greece, we see a common, for lack of better words, room, or maybe suite of rooms, called the Megaron, right? And this seems to be kind of a throne room, maybe of sorts, or maybe, again, combination throne room, kind of religious ritual room, right? So again, we find them at the center of all different Mycenaean palaces, right? Where there's kind of an entryway, kind of hallway in, and then you get the main room here, right? And in the middle of the same room, main room, there was like an open fire pit with kind of like a open skylight square into the sky, right? So this is probably where the Mycenaean kings might have held fort, right? Don't really know. Maybe important religious sacrifices took place. But what's interesting, again, is we see a similar design in the different Mycenaean fortresses, right? So the idea was that, you know, if you were going to be a Mycenaean king, you know, and have this fortress, this was part of it, or should be part of it. Okay, about 1300 BCE, the Mycenaeans hit their height, right? So they've been growing stronger, they've been growing richer, right? So what does their culture look like 1300? All right, we see evidence of kind of Mycenaean connections all throughout the Mediterranean, and even connections with the kingdoms here in Southwest Asia. So remember, right, again, second millennium, big, powerful kingdoms here in Southwest Asia, right? They are the kind of cultural, economic, political force, right? This is the center of the world, but they're also in competition with one another, right? They are oftentimes butting heads, fighting with one another for prominence. And the Mycenaeans are going to find a way to kind of work their way in there sometimes, right? Okay, so what do we see here? 1300. The Mycenaeans have trade connections all throughout the Mediterranean, Southwest Asia. We see goods both coming in, going out, right? Again, speaking to their weight, their wealth, speaking to their wealth. We find evidence of the different kingdoms actually having diplomatic contact with the Mycenaeans, right? Especially the Hittites up here, who are going to be the closest. One of the things that the Asian kingdoms like doing is hiring Mycenaean mercenaries to come and fight with their armies. So as we saw from the archaeological evidence, right, the Mycenaean culture seems to be kind of organized around or focused on warfare. We're assuming that probably made them really good fighters. Whether they were good or whether they were only mediocre, don't know, but the kingdoms here liked hiring them. And so we have evidence of groups of Mycenaeans basically coming over to fight as mercenaries over here in Asia. As a result of that, they actually seem to develop a permanent presence in Asia Minor. Asia Minor, right here, modern Turkey, right? Hittite documents, so remember Hittites, one of the big powerful kingdoms here, talk about kind of a powerful group of Ahiyawa over to the western part of Asia Minor. And this is basically the same word or a similar word to the word that they use to describe the Greeks, right? Which could just be Westerners, you know, but seems to be connected to the Greek name, right? So one of the names the Greeks call themselves, Achaeans. And so this seems to be a Hittite kind of transliteration of the Greek names. So they talk about powerful band of Greeks, of Ahiyawa, right, or Mycenaean Greeks, kind of setting up shop here in Western Asia Minor. And then the most famous of events, right, is the so-called Trojan War, where the stories of Homer, so if you're familiar with the Iliad and the Odyssey, tell us about a great fight, a 10-year battle between the Greeks and the Trojans in Asia Minor. Again, this seems to be grounded in reality, right? That we have a site here that we identify with Troy, that was a very wealthy kind of city-state here, and there appears to be a big conflict between them and the Mycenaeans right about this time period, right, 1250 to 1200. So again, how true or accurate is Homer, we don't know, but it seems to be grounded in the fact that there were big battles between the Mycenaeans and their neighbors to the east. All right, questions here really fast. No, anyone? All right. Okay, oh, here's just another close-up of trade routes. Again, this one gives you a sense of kind of what's going in and out to other places, right? The Mycenaeans, it's mostly sending out pottery. The other big thing that doesn't appear here is mercenaries, right? But then they're getting all sorts of kind of precious metals and goods shipped in from other areas of the world. we know a little bit more about Mycenaean politics and society because, again, we've been able to decipher these writing things, right? Again, lots of guesses, lots of generalities, but what we can tell. We are sure that the Mycenaeans were arranged in city-states, meaning that there's these cities, each one with a fortified kind of palace. Each one appears to be independent, or each one was independent, politically independent, ruled by a king, right? Or a single supreme monarch that they called a wanox. So that was the Mycenaean Greek name for the leader of their city-state, a wanox. Each city-state also had someone called a lawaketas, which means a people leader. And there was one. Our guess, this might have been the commander-in-chief of the military, or the top general of the military. Don't know for sure. We also know that there were two very kind of high-ranking groups of individuals that were very influential in politics. We have their names in Greek, but we don't know exactly what they mean or who they are. We think the best guess is that they're priests and military officers, but we're not entirely sure. There were also officials that made up the lower part of their government called collectors. What did they do? Probably collecting tax and tribute. Most Mycenaeans actually didn't live in the cities, though. The cities seemed to be primarily a space for the elite, right? Most appeared to live, most of the population were in smaller farming villages on the outskirts, and that they would then be called in to serve in the ranks in the Mycenaean armies. There was also a significant population of enslaved persons who were almost certainly war captives, brought in to do the labor. 1200 BCE, there's a period of extended drought all throughout the Mediterranean region, all throughout Southwest Asia, right? All of these kingdoms that I've been talking about, Babylonia, Egypt, Hittites, right? And the Mycenaeans, they're all going to be basically destabilized by this drought, right? It's going to cause worldwide, region-wide economic collapse, and there's going to be an outbreak of even more fighting, right? Because as resources become more limited, there's going to be more conflict over these resources. It's at this point that we see massive attacks happening on the Mycenaean palaces. We're not quite sure who is attacking the Mycenaeans, but they seem to be people coming from the east. They get called the Sea Peoples, right? And then deurbanization, where the cities basically empty out, right? Everyone kind of moves to the countryside, even the farming villages start to get smaller, and that there's a clear sign of economic decline. All right. Last comments here. We'll wrap up. So we talked about Herodotus and Thucydides, looking at these kind of myths and stories to get a sense of their very, very early past, right? In these stories, we get maybe some small glimpses, right, of quote-unquote true history. Much smaller than they see, right? But nonetheless, maybe there's, kind of at least something to the stories, or at least the stories kind of verify something. All right. So, for example, what are the events that lead up to the Persian War? The earliest events that lead up to the Persian War, according to Herodotus. He describes a series of events. I'm blanking on the name again. John, yeah, John. What do you see?
Persian women being kidnapped.
And other women being kidnapped. Greeks kidnapping kind of Eastern or Asian women, we're going to talk more broadly. And in return, Asians kidnapping Greek women, right? So we get some kind of reciprocal back and forth kidnapping, right? And again, where is he getting this information from? Myths. Well, there's the famous story, which again, most people might be familiar with, of the Trojan prince Paris kidnapping Helen, right? One of the Mycenaean queens, or princesses, right? And then this kicks off the Trojan War. Herodotus sees other instances too, right? So we get the stories of Io and Europa, which are maybe less famous myths, but you might have heard of them, that are basically being women who are driven from their homeland, either east or west. Usually it's by the will of the gods, or Zeus is pursuing them because he wants to, have his way with them or something like that, right? But he's like, well, there's these stories of this Greek woman being forced to move to the east and settle, and vice versa. Herodotus says, well, that can't be true. It's not, Zeus and everything else. But maybe these stories about, kind of women being kidnapped and being forced to move and being resettled in these, other territories, right? And there's other stories that other people tell that seem to kind of validate that. So maybe there is this kind of conflict going on, right? And what's interesting, though, right, is he says, well, the Persians say the Phoenicians started. They kidnapped a woman. They brought her back. So the Greeks retaliated. But who are the Greeks that retaliated? Well, we'll go a little bit quicker now because I'm running out of time, right? In paragraph 2, he says, well, the Greeks went and carried off the king's daughter, Europa. These Greeks must have been Cretans. Which sounds like maybe kind of an odd thing to say. Why does he assume that these first Greeks were Cretans? Right? Well, we get a hint in Thucydides, right? Who goes on to tell us about all sorts of stuff and about the development of the navies, right? And who is the first Greek who supposedly developed the navy? King Minos of Crete, right? So clearly, through the myths, right, there's a story that the Cretans used to be this kind of powerful naval-based civilization, exacting tributes from the Athenian cities for the Minotaur, for example, right? Now, is this true? Was there a King Minos? Almost certainly not, right? But this seems to back up what we see archaeologically, right? That Crete was the first area here to build this urban culture, builds up its wealth, exerts its influence over kind of the wider area, right? So it's going to be kind of the earliest, maybe superpower, so to speak, right, in the archaeological record. And that idea seems to have at least been, kind of contained within the myths themselves. So glimpses that we see here, right? We see evidence of the Cretans' past glory. We see references to Mycenae as being an important city in the Trojan War, right? And that these Greek kings are coming together to go fight against the people to the east, the Trojans, right? Were there actual Trojans? Again, don't know, right? But it's clear that the Mycenaeans were going eastwards. They were fighting, especially against people in Asia Minor, right? So again, there is this kind of general kernel of truth here. Last thing I want to call your attention to, sorry to kind of speed through this, right? We see the Phoenicians popping up at various points in the story. We haven't talked about the Phoenicians yet, but they're going to be very important on Wednesday, right? Where do the Phoenicians pop up in these stories? Where do you remember seeing Phoenicians?
Aren't they also kidnapping women from?
Right, so they are supposedly the first Easterners or the first Asians to kidnap a Greek woman. Yep. Where else do we see Phoenicians? Anyone else remember?
Wouldn't they also be like the sea people that?
They could. I mean, there's lots of guesses for who that is. But where else do we see Phoenicians? Prior.
The weapon system?
Well, that's all right. So we don't see it here yet, but it will come up. That'll be Wednesday. But where do we see them in these stories?
Like in the
Yeah, in the stories themselves. Where do we see Phoenicians? So they were the earliest kidnappers. They are also talked about as they're among the barbarians. That's the word for non-Greeks or Asians or Easterners. They all get lumped up under barbarians. The Phoenicians are also
Bible. Yeah.
is it?
In Bible.
In the Bible, yeah, true. They also pop up in the Bible. They're the Canaanites in the Bible. But in these stories here, where do they pop up here? What role do they have besides being pirates and stealing women? Traitors. Right? They get named as traitors in a couple points. And who is Herodotus getting the stories from? The Egyptians, the Persians, okay, obvious. But he also frequently mentions the Phoenicians as being a source of information for, the Phoenicians say this, and this was going on, right? So again, they get referenced as being traitors, as early pirates, as sources of information, right? So again, they're a part of the story that Herodotus, and to a lesser extent Thucydides, is telling. We haven't encountered them yet. We are going to encounter them Wednesday, and I want you to kind of think back to their role here in the stories. All right, that was a little bit of a rush